Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey. Being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 44 of my historical travel podcast Voyage to go, history, where I take you on the most adventurous journeys from the past that continue to shape how we see the world today. In the story I'm currently telling you, we find ourselves on Tahiti, in the Society Islands, where 17-year-old German Georg Forster continues his journey around the world with his father, a naturalist, aboard the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook. Georg's travel narrative was originally written in the elevated language of the late 1700s. I've translated it into modern English to make it more accessible. Since Forster's view reflects the scientific understanding of his time, I will occasionally offer historical context and commentary to bridge the gap between his world and ours. Let's continue this remarkable journey through culture, science, and human connection, as seen through the eyes of one of history's most insightful young travelers. What happened in the last episode? During the previous episode of Voyage to Go History, the Resolution remained anchored off Matavai Bay on the island of Tahiti. The local trade of red feathers had reached its peak, transforming interactions between Tahitians and Europeans. The sailors found themselves highly desired by local women, especially those possessing the rare feathers. In one striking scene, even a chief offered his wife to Captain Cook in exchange for feathers, a moment that deeply shocked Georg and the officers. Remarkable mourning costumes were now offered for trade, once sacred and untouchable, acquired by crew members for museums in Europe. The story then followed a hike inland by Georg's father and Dr. Sparman, during which they climbed through wet, treacherous terrain in search of rare plants. A painful fall left Georg's father injured, but determined to complete the expedition. They returned with botanical discoveries and observations about Tahiti's perfume culture. Meanwhile, life on board had taken a chaotic turn. Decks crowded with visitors, parties of dancing women, and bizarre romantic encounters. The episode closed with Georg's father learning that the beloved local youth, Nuna, would not be allowed to join their voyage to England after all, a decision that left the boy heartbroken. April 1774, Tahiti.
They spent several days in the plains of Matawai and in the great valley of Ahonu. This valley was considered the most fertile and at the same time the most beautiful on the entire island. There, they continued their botanical research. After believing they had thoroughly studied the flora of the lowlands, Georg's father, Dr. Sparman, and Georg once again set out into the mountains on the afternoon of the 6th day to collect more plants. The warm hospitality Georg's father had received from Tahea during their previous visit led them to return to his home. This time, however, they didn't find it necessary to keep a fire going through the night or to stand watch in turns. Tahea was a cheerful and eccentric man who insisted they call him father and his wife mother. The word patea, a tender term similar to the European mama, was used by the Tahitians in the same way. Although they didn't intend to climb the highest peaks, they began their hike before sunrise. The birds were still sleeping in the bushes, and Tahea and his brother caught a few knotty terns with their bare hands. They explained that many water birds spent the night in these mountains, especially tropical birds that nested there. These birds shed their long tail feathers every year, which were often found in the mountains and collected by the locals. During the hike, they shot one tern and discovered several new herbs. But as the sky began to cloud over, they hurried to keep their plants dry and returned to the ship. They reached it around 4 in the afternoon. On board, the entire royal family had gathered. Among them was O2's older sister, Nihaurai, who was married to Teridere, the son of Amo. The king's second brother, Teri Watau, remained on board all night, even after the others had departed. To entertain him, they launched rockets and small fireworks from the mast, which delighted him greatly. At dinner, Teri Watau listed his relatives and told them much about Tahiti's recent history. These accounts were later confirmed by Omai in England. They learned that Amo, Hapai, and Tutaha were 3 brothers. The eldest, Amo, had once been king of all Tahiti. He had married Oberea, a princess of royal blood. From this union came Teridere, who was given the title Eri Rahai, King of Tahiti. At the time Captain Wallace visited the island, Amo ruled together with Oberea, who was also known as Queen Oberea. A year later, in 1768, war broke out between Amo and his vassal Aheatua, the ruler of the smaller peninsula of Tahiti. Aheatua landed in Papara, Amo's usual residence, and dealt his army a heavy defeat. He burned houses and plantations and took pigs and chickens with him. Amo and Oberea fled into the mountains with their entire retinue, including Omai. In December of the same year, Aheatua agreed to peace under the condition that Amo abdicate and that his son forfeit the right of succession to O2, the eldest son of his brother Hapai. The defeated accepted these terms. During O2's minority, Tutaha, Hapai's younger brother, was appointed as administrator. This revolution bore similarities to events in the despotic states of Asia. There, a victorious aggressor would often be content to exploit the conquered land and install a new ruler from the royal family rather than govern the territory himself. Not long after these events, Oberea and Amo quarreled. The tensions escalated into physical conflict, and they decided to separate. Amo took a younger lover, while Oberea shared her affections with a man named Obadi and several other suitors. It seems that Amo was primarily to blame for the discord due to his marital infidelity. Although such incidents were not as common on Tahiti as in England, they were not entirely unknown either. Especially women who had lost their youthful beauty often still demanded the same attention from their husbands that they had received in earlier years. A similar incident occurred aboard their ship. Tahea, who had once been married to Potatau and had recently separated from him, had also found herself a younger lover. However, this man was also involved with another girl and used the ship as a place for secret meetings with her. This connection did not go unnoticed. One morning, Tahea caught her rival by surprise and gave full vent to her anger. She also fiercely reproached her unfaithful lover. At the time, Captain Cook arrived on Tahiti with the Endeavour. The island's government was in the hands of Tutaha. After Cook's departure, Tutaha began planning a campaign of revenge against Aheatua, who had once inflicted a devastating defeat on his family. To rally the nobles of Otahiti Nui, the larger peninsula, to his cause, he likely used wealth received from the Europeans to win their support. A fleet was assembled, and Tahea sailed to Tayarabu. Although Aheatua was prepared, he was already an older man and wished to avoid war. He sent envoys to offer peace. Tahea refused and ordered an attack. The losses were heavy on both sides, so Tahea eventually withdrew and tried to strike Aheatua by land. Hapai disapproved of this decision and remained in Oberea with his family. Still, Tahea went ahead with his plan and, together with Otu and his army, launched an attack on the narrow land bridge that connects the two peninsulas. There, Tahea's army was crushed, and he himself lost his life. Some claimed he had been captured and executed on Aheatua's orders, while others, including Omai, said he had fallen in battle. Otu fled with a few trusted companions into the mountains, while Aheatua led his army toward Matavai and Oberea. As Aheatua approached, Hapai also fled, but received a message from Aheatua assuring him of safe conduct. Eventually, after a difficult escape, Otu returned to his father. A general peace was concluded, and Otu took over the government. The improvements he implemented during his short reign already showed that he was a wise and benevolent leader, with the well-being of his people in mind. Soon after the peace, Aheatua died, and his son, who bore the same name, took over rule of Tayarabu. Te'eri Watau provided them with important information about the royal family. His father had 8 children. The eldest daughter was Tedua, also called Princess Nihorai. She was around 30 years old and married to Te'eri Dera, the son of Amo. The second daughter, also named Tedua, was known as Taurai. She was about 27, unmarried, and held in high esteem, almost on par with the king himself. Otu, the king of Tahiti, was approximately 26 years old. Everyone in his presence was required to show respect by baring their shoulders. Even Aheatua, the ruler of the smaller peninsula, had to perform this gesture of reverence. The fourth daughter, Princess Tehamai, had died young. Te'eri Watau himself was the 5th child. He appeared to be about 16 and mentioned that he had another name, which might have been an honorary title. His younger brother, Tubuaiterai, also called Mayoro, was around 10 or 11. Ereretua, a girl of 7, and Tepau, a boy of 4 or 5, were the youngest siblings. The family had a healthy but not particularly strong build. Their hair was thick and bushy. Their facial features were generally pleasant, though their skin tone was dark brown, except for Niharai and Otu. The family was well liked among the people, which was typical for the Tahitians, who often showed affection for their leaders. The royal family consistently displayed a warm and friendly manner, which explained their popularity. Tedua Taurai often accompanied the king when he visited the ship. She did not hesitate to trade glass beads and other goods with the sailors in exchange for red feathers. Once, she was in the cabin with Otu, the captain, and Georg's father, inspecting supplies and trade goods. When the captain left the cabin, she whispered something to her brother. He distracted Georg's father with questions. Meanwhile, the princess skillfully took a pair of nails and hid them in her clothing. When Captain Cook returned, Georg's father told him about the clever trick the princess had pulled. Both men decided, however, to act as if they had noticed nothing. The princess had already shown a noticeable tendency to secretly take things on several occasions. Yet no one had ever refused her anything, and she was often given more than she asked for. It was strange, that she chose to steal things she could have received in a more proper way. Perhaps she found special pleasure in stolen items because she could attribute them solely to her own cleverness. The Tahitian girls claimed that the princess also secretly spent nights in the company of ordinary tautos, without her brother's knowledge. If this was true, it was remarkable that such secretive behavior occurred especially among princesses and nobles, those who were otherwise used to following their will without restriction. But human passions are the same everywhere. Slaves and princes follow the same instincts, and their stories resemble each other regardless of the land. The next morning, O2 arrived early at Point Venus. He informed the sergeant of the stationed Marines that one of his subjects had stolen a musket from the guard and fled with it. At the same time, he sent a messenger to his brother Terry Watau, who had been on board since the previous evening, to call him back. After breakfast, Terry Watau left the ship. The king was already waiting for his brother on the shore. As soon as he arrived, both fled westward together with other royal dignitaries. They feared the musket might be demanded back from them. To recover the musket nonetheless, Captain Cook, just as he had done in similar cases, resorted to reprisals. He seized several large voyaging canoes belonging to high-ranking individuals, including one owned by a man named Maratata. It was suspected that he had ordered one of his people to steal the musket. Maratata happened to be in one of his canoes at the time of the seizure. He tried to escape the situation by fleeing. However, Captain Cook ordered a few warning shots to be fired at the boat. Maratata and his rowers then jumped into the water and swam ashore. The canoe was confiscated. That evening, T came aboard and reported that the thief had fled to the small peninsula of Tayarabu. In response, all the confiscated boats were released, except for Maratata's. The whole affair had intimidated the islanders. Very few came aboard the ship, and among them were no women. In the evening, Captain Cook went ashore. There, he encountered several Tahitians who were out of breath and drenched in sweat. They brought back the stolen musket, a bundle of clothing, and a double hourglass that had also been taken. They explained that they had caught up with the thief and given him a proper beating. Eventually, they had forced him to show them the place where he had hidden the stolen items in the sand. As sincere as the men seemed, there were doubts about their story. One of them had been seen at the tents only a short while earlier. It was impossible that he could have traveled the distance they claimed in the time available. Nevertheless, Georg's companions pretended to suspect nothing. They even gave the men generous gifts to reward their supposed efforts. But the next day, no one came to trade goods. All commerce had come to a halt. Tich was the only one who still appeared on board. He asked that Captain Cook visit the king in Pare and appease him. The king, he said, was Matau, which in the formal court language meant that he was upset and troubled. To calm him, some gifts should be presented. To that end, the captain and Georg's father went to see the king. Dr. Sparman and Georg went to the tents. They found the Tahitians visibly affected by the previous day's events. What bothered them most was that the Europeans had taken justice into their own hands. The king had strictly forbidden his people from selling food to the foreigners. Yet, due to their natural hospitality, it had been impossible for them not to offer Georg and his companions coconuts and other provisions. Around noon, Georg and Dr. Sparman returned to the ship. They met the captain, who had meanwhile settled everything with the king. That night, the sailors had to do without the usual company of women. The king had explicitly forbidden the women from going aboard, to prevent new conflicts caused by possible theft. The next day, the women apparently received permission to return to the ship. With them came many canoes loaded with food and fresh fish. Captain Cook sent Mahena to the district of Atahuru to thank Admiral Toha for the pigs he had sent, and to present him with return gifts. During Mahena's absence, Oberea came aboard. She also brought the captain 2 pigs. The rumor about the red feathers had reached her residence in the plains of Papara. She made no secret of the fact that she had come specifically to ask for some of those feathers. Oberea was a tall and robust woman. Her face, which might once have been more attractive, now had a rather masculine appearance. Still, one could see traces of former majesty in her expression. Her gaze remained commanding, and her demeanor radiated a certain freedom and dignity. She did not remain on board for long. It seemed to trouble her that she no longer held the same importance in the eyes of the Europeans as she once had. After asking a few questions about friends who had come years earlier aboard the Endeavour, she had herself brought back to shore in her canoe. Around the same time, her former husband, Oamo, also visited the ship. He was received with even less attention than Oberea. As the sailors did not recognize him, he was even denied entry to the captain's cabin. He struggled to deliver his pigs, as the ship was already overflowing with livestock. Amo and Oberea, who had once stood at the top of the social hierarchy, had now fallen far and lived in modest circumstances. They were a vivid example of the fleeting nature of all earthly greatness.
Thursday, May 12, 1774, Tahiti.
Today, they wanted to present a few demonstrations for the king. They fired live-loaded cannons so that the balls and grape shot struck the sea beyond the reef. For the king and the thousands of spectators, it was an impressive and entertaining spectacle. At nightfall, they launched rockets and fireballs into the sky. The audience was even more delighted and amazed. They saw the Europeans as extraordinary beings and could not understand how they were able to summon lightning and stars at will. The Tahitians gave this firework display the reverent name Hiwa Bretanni, the British festival. The following day, the rush of people coming aboard the ship was unusually large. They had noticed that the Europeans were preparing to depart. Instead of food, the visitors now brought cloth and other rarities, which were traded at especially high value. In the afternoon, Captain Cook and the others went to Oberea. There, they met their esteemed friend Toha and Mahena. Toha was suffering from a severe attack of gout and complained of pain and swelling in his feet. Yet he had made the effort to come and say goodbye. He promised to visit the ship the next day. Otu was also present and announced that he had set aside a stock of breadfruit, which at that moment was more useful to the visitors than pigs. On the morning of the 14th of May, they were visited by many nobles from across the island. Hapai and his children, apart from O2, were among the guests. At 8 o'clock, Tahea arrived with his wife. They brought an entire boatload of gifts. Tahea, the old admiral, was so ill that he could no longer stand upright. Yet he insisted on coming aboard. As he was too weak to climb up himself, he was hoisted in a sling chair attached to ropes. During the ascent, he showed as much joy as his countrymen showed amazement. The conversation turned to the upcoming expedition to the island of Eimeo. Tahea assured them that it would take place soon after the Europeans' departure. He declared that his illness would not prevent him from leading the fleet in person. A man of his age, he said, no longer had much to lose, even if it cost him his life. Despite his ailments, Tahea was cheerful and in good spirits. His noble and selfless outlook struck everyone as truly heroic. His heartfelt and emotional farewell moved all who were present. Mahane, who had accompanied Tahea on board, decided to join the Europeans on their journey to Raiatea. From there, he planned to visit relatives and friends on the Society Islands and later return to Tahiti. His plan to sell off his scattered holdings on other islands and concentrate everything on Tahiti was well considered and promising. Mahine brought several companions from Bora Bora with him. One of them he introduced as his biological brother. They asked Captain Cook for permission to travel with the ship to the Society Islands. Cook agreed without hesitation. With pride and in confidence, Mahine mentioned that he had visited Oberea the previous night. He considered this a great honor. He showed the Europeans several fine pieces of cloth that Oberea had given him as a token of gratitude for his faithful service. Oberea, it seemed, was not yet too old for sensual pleasures, although women in this warm climate matured earlier and, accordingly, aged and lost their vitality sooner than those in temperate regions. Since O2 had not come aboard, they visited him on shore. There they saw an impressive number of war canoes anchored off the coast of Oberea, 44 in total, all belonging to the district of Tahea, the smallest region of the island's northwestern peninsula. In their presence, O2 carried out several war exercises, which were performed with remarkable skill. The commanders wore their battle gear, consisting of chest armor, though they wore no helmets. Among them were also very young boys, dressed as warriors, who handled their spears as deftly as the grown men. To defend against enemy spears, they had developed a special technique. They held the tip of a spear or long battle axe to the ground in front of them, while lifting the other end with one hand so that it formed an angle of about 25 to 30 degrees with the body. They moved the weapon according to the direction of the incoming attack, causing the enemy spears to deflect harmlessly off their own. Some of the canoes also performed rowing maneuvers. They passed one by one through the narrow reef entrance. Once inside, they formed a tight line. On the middle canoe stood a man behind a protective barrier, giving signals to the rowers using a green branch, directing them to turn left or right. The rowers paddled in perfect rhythm, so precisely synchronized that it seemed as though the many oars were driven by a single machine. The overseer of the rowers reminded them of the Calyustus of ancient Greece. The sight of the Tahitian fleet brought to mind the naval power of the old republics.
The Calyustus was an important officer on ancient Greek warships, especially triremes. His main duty was to set the rhythm for the rowers to ensure they rowed in unison.
In the following, the two naval powers were compared in even greater detail. The Greeks had the advantage of possessing metal weapons, but apart from that, their arms were likely just as simple. and their combat techniques just as irregular as those of the Tahitians. What Homer embellished as a poet was likely owed to his poetic license. The united power of Greece, which once set sail against Troy, did not seem much more impressive than the fleet with which O2 planned to attack the island of Eimeo. A fleet of Tahitian war canoes, each requiring between 50 and 120 rowers, appeared just as fearsome as Homer's Mille Carino. The seafaring of the ancient Greeks was limited to the archipelago. They sailed from one island to another, and no further. At night, they navigated by the stars, just as the seafarers of the South Seas do to this day. The Greeks were considered brave, and the same had to be said of the Tahitians. The many scars on their leaders were proof of that. It seemed very likely that the Tahitians worked themselves into a kind of frenzy before battle, so that their bravery was more akin to an artificially induced rage. A similar impression is given by the heroism Homer so gloriously portrays in his descriptions of Greek battles. Homer's heroes are described as unusually tall and strong. In the same way, the Tahitian commanders surpass the common man in stature and appearance so clearly that they almost seemed like an entirely different kind of people. An extraordinary amount of food was required to fill an extraordinarily large stomach. The Greek poet praised the Trojan heroes for their plentiful meals, and the same could be said of the Tahitian chiefs. Both nations had a fondness for pork. The simplicity of their customs united them. Their characters were marked by hospitality, humanity, and warmth, qualities that distinguished them from others. There were also similarities in their political structure. The owners of the Tahitian districts were powerful lords. They showed O2 hardly more respect than the Greek heroes did their Agamemnon. In the Iliad, the common man was hardly mentioned. In the same way, the ordinary Tahitian, the Tautau, held little significance. Further parallels between the two peoples could surely be found in other aspects, but the aim was only to point this out without testing the reader's patience with a detailed comparison. What had been presented was sufficient to prove that people at a similar level of culture, even in the most remote parts of the world, could resemble one another. Yet caution was necessary so these observations would not inspire misguided theories. The foolish attempts to construct genealogies of nations had already done harm to historical writing. Even the Egyptians and Chinese had been absurdly portrayed as relatives. It would be desirable for such errors not to spread further.
That brings us to the end of episode 44 of Georg Forster's journey around the world about the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook. A map with the key locations from this episode is linked in the show notes. If you'd like to see how these places look today, visit my YouTube channel Voyage to Go, where I trace Forster's path and explore the echoes of history in the present day. Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next part of our expedition. If you enjoy this podcast and want to support it, you'll find a PayPal link in the show notes. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps continue turning historical source material into immersive episodes like this one. Thank you for supporting Voyage to Go History. The journey continues, and I'd love to have you along for the next chapter. Because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.